Hello, welcome to the presentation about multiculturalism in Sri Lanka. Today's presentation is done by Randika and Jerome Pereira. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Ngunnawal people for us here in Canberra. We would also like to pay our respects to elders past and present.
And we are particularly thankful to the Indigenous peoples of Australia because it was through studying Indigenous Australian history and learning about Indigenous Australians and their strong connection to land and country that inspired us to learn about our own history as Sri Lankans. And so we are thankful to the Indigenous peoples of Australia and for the wisdom and knowledge as well as testimony by elders past and present as well as current and emerging elders for the information and knowledge they have provided us, which has inspired our own journey of discovery into Sri Lankan multiculturalism.
Selamat pagi, bom dia, vanakkam, mama kecak konamai, marhaba, and ayubowan. Today, we are going to talk about multiculturalism in Sri Lanka. The effects of multiculturalism in Sri Lanka has had an impact on many facets of Sri Lankan society, be it culture, tradition, language, attire, religions, or cuisine. Its impact can be seen everywhere.
So we've decided that the best place to begin talking about Sri Lankan multiculturalism is at the first census. The first census of Sri Lanka was conducted in 1871 during British Ceylon. And this is a particularly interesting census because it identified over 79 points of origin for the then population of Ceylon, which was about 2.4 million people. And this census was fascinating because it identified a huge diversity in Sri Lanka's population. There were people from all over the world in Sri Lanka, from northern and central Europe, from southern Europe, from the Indian subcontinent, from as far as Papua New Guinea and Eastern Asia, from places like China. There were people from sub-Saharan Africa as well as Northern Africa and places all over the world. And so the way to understand multiculturalism, in our opinion, is to look at this early document as a starting point for understanding the base amount of diversity that we had in Sri Lanka. And as you can see from this census, it was a highly diverse population of people made up from all over the world and from whom we are all descended.
When discussing Sri Lankan multiculturalism, it's important to begin by talking about the first peoples of Sri Lanka, which is the Vanyalatho. Evidence has shown that Vanyalatho have been in Sri Lanka for at least 48,000 years. There are multiple communities, such as a lot of us might be familiar with the Uruwarige community in Dambana, but there's also other communities such as the Morinawarge and the Rugamwarge and other communities that live on the coast. As the first peoples of Sri Lanka, the Vanyalatho have had a significant impact on the composition of Sri Lankan culture as we know it today.
The Manyaletho have a deep connection to the land. Their concept of demonology also includes various yaku or nayaku, which are ancestral demons. There are flower, rock, and tree demons as well, and this forms part of the Vanyaletho spiritual beliefs. Vanyaletho have a unique language, which has no known root language, and also form the basis upon which to understand Sri Lankan multiculturalism, as they were the first and indigenous people of Sri Lanka and continue to live in and around and continue to live all around the island to this day. So next slide, Randika. Look, we really struggled to quantify the ethnic diversity in Sri Lanka. So having talked about the first Sri Lankans, let's look at everybody else. There were just too many ethnic groups to list, honestly, and it was very difficult because the list would have just looked like a long list. It wasn't very pleasant, so we tried to put as many of them as we could onto this umbrella, this beautiful graphic Randika created. Because these are all communities that live in Sri Lanka, not necessarily captured in the Sri Lankan census, but these are a few of the communities that descend from various historical threads in Sri Lanka. So here you've got the Burmese community, the Moors, the Javans, the Chinese community, the Malay community, People forget Sri Lanka has its own gypsy community as well. We have a Chinese community, historical and modern. Um, and yeah, the Afro-Ceylonese community. We have Turkic Sri Lankans who come from the former Ottoman Empire, Bharatas, Memons, Moors, and so on. So it's just, I think, nicer to display it this way and just to understand the sheer diversity in our communities in Sri Lanka. And a quick note on ethnic diversity and being Sri Lankan. It's really important to remember that we tend to view Sri Lankan communities as disparate, like there's the majority, there's a minority, there's Sinhala, Tamil, Chinese people, and so on. But we forget that over the course of our history, many of these communities have become Sri Lankan, right? So a quick note on ethnicity and belonging. For example, when the Portuguese arrived somewhere in the 1500s, they were Portuguese people. But by the time the Dutch arrived in Sri Lanka, those Portuguese people had been there for, 150 to 200 years, which means they were now Sri Lankan. And those people, those Dutch people, then became the Dutch burghers. And then they are Sri Lankan, obviously. And then those British people who came afterwards became Sri Lankan. I have some of them in my family. They're definitely Sri Lankan. But we tend to view these communities as distinct, but really they became Sri Lankan through the process of living there. In fact, if we really think about it, when the Dutch came, it was the Portuguese Sri Lankans who defended Sri Lanka against the Dutch, which is a really interesting thing to think about, right? Look, if I can become an Australian in one generation, I moved here when I was 19. I think people who've been in Sri Lanka for hundreds of years, sometimes thousands, as Sri Lankan as any other ethnic group that that's been living there. So this is what we thought of when it came to ethnic groups. Next slide, Randika. Important point here is we had in Sri Lanka colonial communities. Everyone knows what those were. But we also had non-colonial communities. In fact, most of the ethnic groups in Sri Lanka are non-colonial in the sense that they settled in Sri Lanka for various reasons, but not necessarily invading or colonizing the country. So Moors, the Muslim community of Sri Lanka, descended from Arab traders over half a millennium ago. They've been there for hundreds of years. Afghan Sri Lankans, they came to Sri Lanka at various times. Boras, Khojas, even the Persian community, because the ancient Persian empires traded with Sri Lankans, and many of those people stayed along. Malay communities, even the Turkic communities were often made up of travelers or settlers. So we need to, I think, also remember that these linear narratives we have about minorities and the fact that they came at a certain time are very misleading. For example, Malay and Afro-Ceylonese people fought for Kandyan kings, which meant they were there hundreds of years before people think they came. In fact, Portuguese Sri Lankans were there in Sri Lanka at various times for hundreds of years. They're closing in on half a millennium in Sri Lanka. There's a few lovely poems written by Portuguese Sri Lankans in the past. And you can almost see the process of them becoming Sri Lankan in those poems. You can access these poems in their archives. But just to prove how vigorously Sri Lankan some of these communities were, when the Dutch took over the forts in Sri Lanka, the Portuguese fought so hard for Sri Lanka. The Portuguese Lankans and the other communities fought so hard that a new saying emerged in the Dutch Empire, which was gold in Malacca, lead in Gaul. That is because the Portuguese Sri Lankans and the others in those forts and in Sri Lanka did their best to repel the Dutch as Sri Lankans, not as Portuguese people. So this is just a list of some other communities that were also part of the Sri Lankan landscape, but who aren't necessarily colonial. Next one, Randika. Another thing we don't often discuss in Sri Lanka is the slave trade. So Sri Lanka had a thriving slave trade. Randika and I are about to make a short video about this. It was the Indian Ocean slave trade. And most of us are familiar with the Atlantic Ocean slave trade from Western Africa to the United States and on the west coast of Africa and the Canadian colonies and so on. But we had an equivalent one here on our side of the African continent on the Indian Ocean. A huge number of Sri Lankans were people who were descended from people brought over as slaves by various communities. Nearly everyone in Sri Lanka took part in the slave trade. I was reading some records in the 1600s, and everyone from Sinhalese, Tamil, Dutch, Portuguese, everyone was participating in the slave trade. But because we're on the Indian Ocean side, the communities who were enslaved were different. In Sri Lanka's case, there were a lot of people from the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, parts of Africa on the eastern coast of Africa. And really, it was so big that at one point, 53% of Colombo's population was made up of enslaved people. So the majority of the population of Colombo was made up of enslaved people from various places. And I've just given you some names here from the records. These are real people: Cleopatra, Augustus. Then there's Apollo van Makassar, who was an Indonesian slave who was born in Makassar. And you can find records and stories about these people in the old Dutch records of slavery in Sri Lanka, which I consulted a little while ago. It's absolutely fascinating to read these people's stories. And again, these people mixed in with the local communities over centuries, and they became ancestors to many of us alive now. So that's another thing that we should keep in mind. So when we think of Sri Lankan communities, there was the colonial ones, there was the non-colonial ones, there was people from the slave trade, and various settling communities.